Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Hello, can people hear me?
We can, yes, sir, yes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Horndon, and I'm Inspector appointed to examine the Brentwood local plan along with my colleague, Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Wright, can you just say hello?
I was about to say good morning, but good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Apologies that we have been running the session that was taking place this morning overran, and so we're starting around 15 minutes late. I understand that a number of participants were trying to get into that session which actually hadn't started, so apologies for that, but please rest assured that we will have a full session on this matter, and if it goes beyond our scheduled time of 1 o'clock, then so be it. So I don't want us to finish that here today with not having people having said what they need to say. So please be rest assured. I think that everybody who is on the in the session has been here before, but can I just please let me check that we've got everyone here who needs to be here. And if you could just please introduce yourselves, switch on your camera and introduce yourselves. From the council, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Shadarivian, QC for the council.
Good afternoon, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy, Brentwood Council.
Good afternoon, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Thank you. And has Mr. Johnson, is Mr. Johnson still here?
Yeah. Good morning, Inspector. Brendan Johnson, Essex County Council, Local Highway Authority.
Mr. Johnson, from the point you made earlier, you may have to leave.
I might have to, yes. I've basically got to be at a hospital for 1:30, so but it's only 10 or 15 minutes up the road, so I might have to dash about 1:15 if that's all right.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. If there's any points that you've not said when you need to leave, then please say so.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hallam Land, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Gary Stevens for Marin's Planning, acting on behalf of Hallam Land Management.
Stevens. Estates and Agency, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Stuart Mills from Iceni Projects, representing Estates and Agency.
And West Horndon Parish Council.
Good afternoon. My name is Councillor Colin Fone. I'm Vice Chairman of West Horndon Parish Council, but I lead on planning matters. I will say a few more things about West Horndon Parish Council at a later stage so that you can understand the context of where we come from on this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fone. Can I, everybody's been to the session before, so there's no need to go through any more housekeeping matters. And I'll like to move straight into the site, please. Could I ask Mr. Quilter, please, I think, or Mr. Drain, Mr. Quilter's nodding, to just please introduce the site and just provide some background and just update us as to where we are now. There is a very short statement of common ground, which I'd like to look at, but can you just briefly introduce the site and explain the current position?
Thank you, Inspector. I'm conscious that Councillor Fone will probably know a lot more than me about the history of the site, but I'll do my best to cover that. If there's anything I've missed, I'm sure he'll be able to pick up on that. But in any case, the history of the site, in terms of its history of the local plan, it has been proposed as an allocation through many versions of that document. In terms of its its current status, there is an operating industrial estate on the site. The site is effectively split into two main halves. So we've got the eastern side, which is where the main entrance that sort of faces into the village and opposite the West Horndon train station. And then there's the western side, which fronts on to Childerditch Lane with its own separate access. In terms of the land ownership, that has in more recent years that's come under the majority of the site, not all of it, but the majority of the site has come under the control of Hermes Real Estate Investments. So they more recently in the last few years purchased the western side of the site, so in combination with their eastern side of the ownership. There's also another main owner who's equally promoting the site, which is the Kroll Group, and they control the land that abuts the village on the eastern side and the main buildings that accompany that. So in terms of the proposals, the proposals involve the redevelopment of the site. Apologies, I should mention also that there is some units to the north of the industrial estate, which are more recently built within the last 10-15 years. I may be wrong on that one, but they're more recent in any case, that they are under their own separate freehold. In terms of the development of the site, is the redevelopment of the industrial estate for residential use, or principally for residential use. And in terms of what's set out within the policy, as with other strategic sites of this size, the requirement for a care home, self and custom build properties, and also the provision of 2 hectares of land for employment purposes. So yeah, in terms of the ongoing nature of the site in itself, there have been ongoing discussions with the council in respect of pre-application discussions, but I'm assuming we can probably come on to that further, but happy to follow on if needed.
Thank you. Can we just sort of Councillor Phone?
Yeah, I mean, that is fundamentally the position as we see it. We as a parish council support it for the very reason that it's an industrial estate in not a very good area for an industrial estate, and we would support the fact that by changing it from industrial to residential, we will reduce significantly the amount of very heavy traffic that goes through the village at all times of day and night, and also the amount of heavy traffic that goes over the railway bridge, which, to be honest, is just inappropriate to put Arctic lorries of that size over that railway bridge with all the bends and such like. So we basically support it, but there are issues around access that are by no means resolved at the present minute.
Thank you very much, Councillor Phone. Mr. Quilter, could you please outline how you've arrived at the capacity of the site? I think there is a fairly overall a fairly high, reasonably high density of housing development. Can you please explain how you arrived at the total figure of 580 new homes?
Certainly, thank you, Inspector. So yeah, the proposed allocation sets out the requirement for 580 dwellings, based on the site size that gives an approximate density of 57 dwellings per hectare. So in terms of obviously the position, there's a fine balance to be had between obviously recognising that this is a village location. It's obviously the other side of it is equally an opportunity, a brownfield opportunity. So it's not within the green belt. So we're looking to maximise densities, equally recognising the train station next to the site. Now, of course, there is the wider sort of area that we need to consider about the improvements to the train station, which have obviously been mentioned earlier in other sessions on Dunstan Hills, and clearly the connection there. But I think, as Councillor Foam rightfully pointed out, the link between this site and the train station is more to do with the access and how that then facilitates both better access to the station and also to the site. So certainly there is that connection there. But yeah, that's a sort of brief summary of that.
So does that mean that what does that mean in terms of the planning of the site? Is it development of higher stories, or is it development of more flats, or how would that manifest itself on the site in terms of that level of density?
Certainly. So the earlier sort of pre-app discussions that have taken place have obviously looked at a mix of types of units. Yes, principally there will be some high density units of apartments. So certainly there will be a larger, I suppose, a higher building height in terms of what's there currently. The intention obviously is to ensure that we're getting a good mix of units on there to meet the local needs, or meet the needs of what the council obviously needs to identify. So certainly the actual density would obviously result in that, in terms of higher density buildings on the site, but certainly a mixture. I think really it's obviously that link again to the train station from our view, and obviously ensuring that we're maximising densities wherever we can.
And what evidence is there that so I can understand about the need to maximise densities near to a public transport hub, but what evidence is there that actually a developer would be interested in taking on this site, a part of the site, at such high densities?
So as we mentioned earlier, we've got the letter from the main promoter, Hermes Real Estate Investment, that are setting out that they consider that to be an appropriate number in terms of what could be delivered on the site. And certainly, obviously, there's not been an indication so far in terms of discussions that have taken place on more detailed basis for pre-application that that's not an unrealistic prospect. And I don't feel that the densities are out of kilter really in terms of what could be brought forward around a transport hub, as you mentioned. We feel that's obviously in line with what in terms of what the HELA set out, as we mentioned, obviously talking through yesterday on the site selection methodology. Obviously there is that broad application of densities, and this would sort of fit within that really in terms of what's expected to come forwards.
Thank you. I'll come on to look at where we are in terms of the planning application in a moment, and the way in which the site would expect to be developed. But Councillor Phone.
Fundamentally, the density is not an issue, but the one question we have about it is that there seems to be an assumption by Hermes, who have put forward outline planning plans to it, that there's going to be very restricted space for people to have cars. Now, I'm very aware of government policy and all sorts of policies on cars, but we do have to recognise that West Horndon, yes, it's a transport hub, we have a railway station, but it only goes east-west. And to be honest, as you live in this village, you do need to be able to have a car to get out of it. And the bus service at the present minute is appalling. You only get about 4 or 5 buses a day into the village. I can't see that is going to increase significantly. So we do need to be aware that maybe, and I just question whether or not the provision of car parking spaces to these very tightly packed dwellings are as appropriate as some people seem to think it is. I don't think it is personally, based on having lived in this sort of environment for 38 years. You do need access to a car. Thank you.
Mr. Coulter?
Thank you, Inspector. Yeah, we do recognise, obviously, there is an important need to ensure that appropriate levels of parking provision are in place in line with the parking guidance, obviously, that we follow, although we intend to follow with this emerging plan as well. So I think it's certainly that's been taken account of in terms of trying to make sure that the densities are appropriate. So I think there's still, obviously, through the application process, obviously, in terms of the actual allocation as set out, we feel that's an achievable prospect, but certainly through what's been promoted, obviously, in terms of the ongoing pre-app discussions, the developers feel that there is potential for a higher density, but that would be at the cost of parking provision. So I think that in terms of that further sort of I suppose bolsters up our position in terms of thinking that the 580 figure is a more appropriate number for the purpose of an allocation of relying upon those numbers. But they would obviously need to demonstrate if they were going to deviate from those parking provision requirements as to whether that's appropriate.
Thank you. And the existence of the station. Sorry, Councillor Phone, you still got your hand up. Is it? Sorry. Okay, thank you. The existence of the station. So, was that the overriding factor in council putting forward the site for housing? And what were those? What was the council's thought processes in putting forward an existing industrial estate for housing?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I think that the other factor is that the site was being promoted for redevelopment. So it wasn't just the case that the council was forcing that issue. I think it was in reflection of what was coming forward in terms of that intent to redevelop the site. Certainly, the other factors I think would be more because of that availability. The other factor, clearly, most importantly, is also the fact that we're talking about a brownfield redevelopment site in terms of our sequential approach, not wanting to put more pressure onto the greenbelt. And so therefore we thought that was guided us towards the allocation in itself, because it's felt that was an appropriate choice in terms of making sure that we're maximising, apologies to repeat myself, but maximising the brownfield opportunities as much as possible. I think obviously to touch upon the loss of employment land, now clearly we have dealt with that through the economic futures report, which we did discuss in the week one's hearing sessions. So yes, certainly we have accounted for that loss, and obviously there is a need to make sure we've got the net amount of employment land is accounting for any of those losses in the borough.
And how does the council envisage? Obviously, we've got the policy before us, but how does the council envisage the site to be knitted into the existing West Horndon village?
So certainly it needs to have a master planned approach, and that's obviously part of those ongoing discussions, really, as an important aspect of that. Really, from our perspective, it serves a key location within the village in terms of obviously the train station itself is a focus, and in terms of the current, in terms of the history of the village, again, I'm sure Councillor Phone knows more details than me in terms of the longer term history, but the industrial estate is effectively where the village grew up from in broad terms. So obviously the original planning of that in terms of the way it's set out now is probably not how you would obviously carry out that type of development, whether that was industrial or residential otherwise. So in terms of it's certainly a key opportunity to provide some real benefits to the village and the people that live there already in terms of providing a sort of a well integrated development. So certainly I think it's got those opportunities to provide good. Obviously, I appreciate there needs to be a good consideration of the relationship, particularly on that boundary on the eastern edge, which joins the existing residential development that's already there. But certainly that can be accounted for through the master planning process.
And Councillor Phone, how does the existing industrial estate relate to the village in providing source of employment and what is it well connected to the village?
Not really, no. The number we have done a number of surveys over the years, and the number of people living in the village that work there is pretty small and has in general been going down. Although there have been a few extra that have moved to working there since COVID came along. But the vast majority of people who work on that site either come into the site via the railway station, or they are driving large, heavy Arctic lorries into the village, through the village, and therefore the site as it stands at the present minute is not really connected There are a couple of small sites where, for instance, people who are involved in the construction industry have their equipment and vans, but they are very small. The vast majority of the site is, for instance, Tufnell's undertaking their distribution from there, and there are some others. So I wouldn't describe it as well connected with the village at the minute. And if those jobs moved elsewhere, they would not significantly affect this community.
And how does the council? What's the pattern of employment numbers on the site? What's the trend? Is there a downward trend? Is there a static position? And what's the council's overall view about relocating those uses and retaining those uses, those jobs within the borough?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think I've necessarily got the exact figures to hand. Obviously, that would be probably more commercial level information that we wouldn't be party to. But in terms of the broad uses on the site, we are talking about general industrial distribution uses, sort of maybe some manufacturing taking place on there. I may be wrong on that, but in terms of the approach that's been set out by by Hermes Real Estate Investment, who own the majority of the sites, that their view that they've got, as set out in the letter that's been recently submitted to the examination library, that they've obviously been managing the leases on those sites accordingly, so that there is a short-term leases that enables when they are able to proceed following a successful application, that they're able to terminate those leases in the short term. Now, from the point of view, obviously, from the council in terms of its approach to employment land, now clearly we haven't got much sway in terms of directly providing like-for-like replacements for individual businesses. That is obviously a commercial decision about whether they locate in this industrial estate or another in terms of costings. And clearly, more recently, as we've alluded to in terms of the impacts of COVID, there's going to be certain changes on the ahead already have happened, I'm sure. But in terms of what we've tried to account for, we obviously, particularly in the southern corridor, which this is, as we've categorised it, we've got other employment sites which are going to be expanded or improved. So we've got the Brentwood Enterprise Park now, except obviously from the perspective of that being a strategic scale employment site, there may not necessarily be like-for-like replacement there for something like West Horndon. Something like Childerditch Industrial Estate is proposed to be expanded, and as we'll come on to that session, they're looking to remodel the site to improve the choice available on that site. That's not far from West Horndon. East Horndon Industrial Estate, again down the road in the same parish as West Horndon, has got outline consent, is also a proposed allocation of plan. And there are employment opportunities and employment land that's going to be coming forward through the Dunton Hills proposal. So I certainly think, although we can't stipulate that there is going to be an exact unit for a particular user within West Horndon Industrial Estate, there certainly will be the choice and availability of that. And in terms of the broad terms of actually the amount of employment land that's going to be within the plan, we're certainly looking to meet our needs. We're taking into account the losses of sites such as West Horndon.
Thank you. The statement of common ground of the letter refers to, I think Hermes used the word that they are hopeful that a planning application can be submitted in 2021. It doesn't suggest certainty. Are you able to tell me where that planning application process is up to?
Yes, certainly. I suppose also to frame that with regards to their letter, they have identified that the delivery timeframes as were originally set out in the trajectory of the plan, that they feel that they should be moved back a bit. And I understand obviously those points have been raised by Mr. Stevens, Mr. Mills in their hearing statements, so we can come on to that. But in terms of the, as we've mentioned earlier, there have been ongoing pre-application discussions, obviously working through master plan proposals, but obviously as Councillor Fone has mentioned, I'm sure Mr. Johnston will cover as well, that obviously the main aspect of bringing that forward is dealing with the access arrangements for the site. Now, they're not insurmountable, but certainly there's clearly a lot of aspects that needs to be dealt with. So the key thing is making sure they can achieve safe access. Obviously, we're dealing with a situation with the existing industrial estate where those weren't necessarily considerations. So the access is onto an outside of the bend, which then leads onto a bridge. But certainly there's, through this work that we've in terms of the South Brentwood Transport Vision document, I've probably got the title of that completely wrong, but I can find the reference, but that document does provide some indicative proposals about how that could be achieved, and that certainly has helped those discussions. So there is that process as part of that. That's probably the main aspect that's ongoing. But in terms of an intent to provide an application, certainly Hermes Real Estate Investment and the Kroll Group, as I say, the two main parties, are prepared to advance applications as quickly as possible. And there is the potential for the Kroll Group land to be advanced. It doesn't necessarily have to be advanced as a single application. They can be provided as two applications, but obviously there needs to be a master plan process to connect the two.
So which is the Kroll Group land? In broad terms, is it which part of the site is?
So it's as you look at the site. So if you're on the corner where you've got the entrance, it's the land directly to the north. So you've got a building that runs north south. So that piece of land, and then you've got the open land, and the car park to the rear of that. It basically backs onto Petersfield Way. So that forms the Kroll Group land ownership, and then the Hermes land is the rest. And obviously, So the Kroll Group is a small and fairly distinct part of the application. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but they both obviously sit on that main part in the centre of the village in terms of the entrance.
Thank you, Councillor Phone.
Just as a quick observation, Hermes had discussions with us for many years. And I have to say, since 2015, they've been saying we will submit an outline planning application within the next 6 to 9 months. And one doesn't seem to have occurred, but just as an observation.
Mr. Mills.
Thank you, sir. As I think Mr. Quilter alluded to, that the main sort of comments that we have on this site really are about timescales and those lead-in times. And as we've set out, we're anticipating 2024-25 was the earliest realistic point for delivery. And I welcome the fact that the letter from Hermes from a couple of days ago really kind of supports that case in terms of that further slippage from where the council was previously anticipating. So I think, as Councillor Phone says, there has been quite a history of slippage on this site. As you say, I think Hermes say that they're hopeful to submit an application this year, but obviously that depends on timescales, how they progress a pre-app, potentially adoption of the local plan, etc. So I think there's a lot of stages in terms of planning still to go through, and a certain amount of uncertainty. And it'd be helpful to understand if there's any further evidence behind those timescales. But I'd say I think sort of 2024-25 is very much the earliest we'd expect any units to come forward. Obviously, with the existing site being occupied by tenants, some details to be ironed out in terms of exactly when they're going to be vacated, the master plan process to be gone through, etc. And we'll come on to the implications in terms of sort of housing more generally next week. But I think obviously just to flag at this stage that this is an example of where slippage in terms of the trajectory does have a knock-on impact in terms of the overall delivery of housing for Brentwood. I think since the original submission of the plan, 195 units have been lost in years 6 to 8 from the site. So I think that just highlights the need for a suitably robust housing supply overall, with sufficient headroom to allow for these sorts of slippages and to ensure that there's early and effective delivery of housing in the early stages of the plan. Just one other point, I'm sure we'll come on to infrastructure sort of later on, but just obviously the policy R02 talks about sort of creating a new village centre, linking into station enhancements, enhanced bus services, etc. And obviously any delay in terms of delivery of housing on this site will presumably also have knock-on delays to the delivery of that infrastructure and the benefits to the village that Mr. Quilter outlined. So also just sort of picking up on the implications of that and when any benefits will be delivered. and also how that links into Dunton Hills Garden Village more widely, and how the two sites come forward, and any benefits that might be arising from the West Horndon Industrial Estate, which are required to deliver the benefits for Dunton Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Mills.
Thank you.
Just looking at the from where we are now to when houses are expected to be delivered on the site, looking at that start point, I think that we've got from Hermes the anticipation that it'll start a couple of years later than what was originally anticipated, but there's still quite a lot of work to do, I think, isn't there, on taking the site forward, with existing uses on the site, existing tenancies on the site. Site would have to be cleared. There's got to be pre-application discussions. There's got to be master planning, presumably an outline application put together. I've got some questions on how the phasing would work, because there's a managed process, but it seems to me that it's a significant challenge of houses on the site being delivered in the time period set out in the letter, isn't it? Well, how would you envisage getting to that point, given all the constraints and factors that have to be taken into account in bringing it forward?
Yeah, thank you, Inspector. I think, as we've obviously said, it's not a case that those discussions haven't already been ongoing. In terms, obviously, yes, we've got the site access matters that need to be resolved, but by no means is it a case that the other aspects of the site aren't being thought through in terms of the appropriate way that can be brought forwards. And certainly in terms of phasing, I think that it's not a case that, from the perspective, as we mentioned earlier, the site is split into two. In terms of, we have currently got two accesses in terms of Childitch Lane and onto Station Road, and the fact that we've got the Kroll land as well, which is on the entrance as well, that obviously offers opportunity to bring forward development in the early phases. And yes, clearly there will need to be clearing of the site, and as obviously mentioned in the letter from Hermes, they have obviously been managing those leases in respect of that site being vacated. So certainly they're confident that can be brought forward in that manner, and that side of things. So I think from our point of view, the times that are now being suggested obviously account for that, and obviously recognising that there is obviously process involved in terms of bringing forward application to determination, but by no means is it insurmountable. I think it's certainly a way that can be managed through that process, in terms of making sure that the site is delivered in a phased manner.
Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on that point, really. Just firstly in relation to the start date, and again, just to make the point that we have no objection to the allocation. It is just the trajectory and how many houses it will deliver towards the plan requirement that is our concern. The start date then is now given as 2024-2025, and I think it's 65 dwellings in that first year.
80 80.
80, sorry, sir. So that suggests it's a full year's worth of completions on the site. So they're starting to build on April the 1st, 2024. So just working back from that date to where we are today, it clearly is a brownfield site. There's occupiers, there's buildings to be demolished, land to be remediated, access works to be undertaken. Even a sort of conservative estimate would say at least a year for groundworks and works to be enabled to enable a first sort of house to be built and occupied. and there may well be temporary arrangements required, because obviously there are existing occupiers that would still be operating on the site. So we would say at least a year, sort of, in terms of getting those works on site. So that takes you to sort of April 2023. Now, let's give Hermes the benefit of doubt here as landowner, that they do submit the outline. Presumably it's an outline application, they're not house builders, so presumably an outline application this year, 2020-21. That would give, in effect, the whole of 2022 and the first part of 2023 to both grant outline planning permission, and we've been made aware this morning that there obviously still are issues to resolve in terms of access and density. The Section 106 to be resolved. Now, obviously there will be contributions from this site towards infrastructure, both in West Horndon and I suspect on the A127 corridor, which will require some careful consideration about how those costs are apportioned between this development and Dunton Hills. There's clearly then a house builder to be appointed and secured, reserve matters approvals, discharges of pre-commencement conditions. So in our view, to do all of that in the space of 2022 and the early part of 2023 is just unrealistic. And our evidence, which is in our Matter 8 statement, is that a more realistic start date would be 2026, 2027. And that would give, we feel, would give sufficient time for all those issues to be satisfactorily resolved and a more realistic start date for this site. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Councillor Phone.
Yes, there is one other thing that I think, and I don't know how well Hermes have assessed it, but there have been on this site a number of quite serious industrial processing operations, and I don't know how well the contaminated land situation is assessed, but there could be some surprises in that area. I speak very carefully at this point because I cannot remember what is public domain information and what isn't. But I am a retired pollution inspector, and there were things going on that site that I think if they were being done today would cause concern. So I just put it forward that careful consideration of how contaminated that land is and what needs to be done to it before it could be used for residential purposes and needs to be it's an unknown that needs to be carefully considered.
Thank you very much, Councillor Phone. Mr. Stevens, is your hand up still from before? Thank you. Mr. Quilter.
Yes, thank you, Inspector. I would disagree with the point that Mr. Stevens is putting forward that the 26-27 is appropriate. I mean, obviously, as we say, that appreciating his points, I understand his points, but in terms of obviously what's been set forward by the site promoters, or obviously have the information before them in terms of what they feel could be brought forward, so that's deemed to be appropriate. I think in terms of that first year, 24, 25, 80 units, as we mentioned, obviously the Kroll land, that has opportunities to come forward as part of that in terms of separate application. Not all of that is brownfield. As you'll see from the aerial images, there is part of that land which is currently greenfield land, so it wouldn't necessarily require any removal of, termination of tenancy and that demolition of buildings. Clearly, yes, the investigation into terms of whether the land is contaminated would need to be undertaken in any case. But obviously, at this stage, we're not under any impression that there is any significant concerns in respect of that to add to the timeframes to bring us forward this site. I think in terms of Section 106, probably I'm jumping between two there, but in terms of Section 106, that can be negotiated through the plan application process, and certainly would be. Yeah, and it's something that there would be ongoing discussions as we speak. The infrastructure infrastructure contributions, as mentioned, that's the same for every site, and we're expecting all sites to contribute fairly in terms of the requirement to provide for mitigation, and we'll come on to that session in terms of infrastructure contributions. But by no means is this site an exception to the rule. The other sites are in the same ballpark of having to provide those contributions, and under the viability assessment, that's considered to be appropriate. So I'll leave that one there.
Thank you, Mr. Coulter. Are there active discussions with your development control colleagues on pre-application discussions on site?
Certainly, yes. The pre-app discussions have been ongoing, and the development management colleagues have been involved with that throughout. So, obviously, leading on that. So, yes, that's the answer.
Mr. Mills?
Thanks, sir. Just a small point. Just picking up Mr. Quilter, as I understand it, was suggesting that the Kroll land could come forward separately and potentially in advance of the Hermes land, if I've understood that correctly. I just wondered, has there been any actual pre-app discussions directly with the Kroll group, and if they've given any intention of their timescale separate to Hermes?
Mr. Coulter?
Yes, so they have been involved in those discussions, and jointly with Hermes, by no means in isolation. So they both groups or both landowners recognise the requirements of the policy and the sites bringing those sites forwards, and certainly the intent is obviously to bring that forward as a master plan project. So by no means are we advocating that it has to be separate, just outlining that that obviously can be, and there is a possibility of that, and we're not precluding that from what's been set out in the policy, merely to sort of bolster up the point that we feel that the 80 units at that first year, 24-25, we feel it can come forward as part of the whole scheme, but certainly that Kroll land is providing that certainty of that.
Thank you. In terms of when the proposal starts and how the site is taken forward, what is the council's understanding of how that would be managed? Is it that houses would start to be developed from one end and the employment would be managed off the site from the other end, for example?
Yes, so I mean, I think in terms of the phasing plans that I have seen, appreciating their pre-application stage, they have sort of looked at the gradual redevelopment of the existing units, and obviously the vacation would be in line with that. So I think it's certainly as I understood it, the eastern side would probably be developed in advance of the western side, or they could be done in alternate orders. But in any case, the point being is that would be able to be achieved through that phased approach.
So when in terms of the trajectory that the trajectory that Hermes have put forward is the same scale of development. It just slips back. So those midpoint years of there's 100 in 2 years and 95 is nearly 100 in one of the years. So in those mid years, there are 100 or very close to 100 units being delivered. Is that realistic?
Yeah, I believe so. In terms, obviously, if the way it can be phased is obviously things can be done concurrently. So in terms of the developments, if there was the eastern and western side divided up in that way, they could be phased in such a way that they could bring forward those developments concurrently, and equally the Kroll Group land. I think obviously the fact that we're going to be looking at a number of apartments on the site, that would allow for those numbers to be achieved in relatively, obviously those periods of times that are outlined. So that's our view.
Thank you. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yeah. I mean, just on the sort of completion rates, obviously the submitted plan had a completion rate of 65 dwellings per annum for this site through the plan period, and that figure, as we know, has now changed to increased to 80 and 95 and then 100. And I don't know if there's any explanation from the council as to what has changed since that time to explain that. But we do feel that completion rates seem high for a site of this nature. And it's just what's also, I suppose, concerning us slightly with this site is we know it's a phased release, and we know there's obviously some businesses that will continue to operate. And it's how sites such as, say, the Kroll land, which I know is a relatively small part of this site, but how that would come forward for housing, presumably with alterations to the access to enable it to come forward for housing, in a context when other parts of the site are still in use for employment purposes and businesses still operating, still requiring access for articulated lorries, as we've heard. So it just doesn't seem straightforward, this site, and I think that's why we've suggested a more cautious approach is given to its trajectory in the plan. I'm not saying these issues can't be worked through and they're not insurmountable, but it does suggest that you should be cautious in terms of how many houses can be delivered on this site at any one time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Inspector, let's come back on that point that Mr. Stevens raised in respect of the 65 units per annum, obviously in the submitted plan, which was subsequently updated in document F26. The reason for that really was on the basis that the original trajectory was a simple straight line trajectory of assuming those numbers on an annual basis. The numbers, obviously, as presented now, have been informed by the actual site promoters, and I think further so to what we've set out. So they're further refined, I should say, obviously based on what we've originally submitted. So our view is that the numbers as presented now obviously are more provide further realistic prospect based on the fact they have been put forward by the people actually bringing forward the site.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Coulter. There's quite a different number of requirements, as you'd expect for development of this site size. Commercial centre, health centre, community centre, open space, links to the station, etc. Is the site viable with all those requirements on?
Thank you, Inspector. Yes, I mean, in terms of the policies as presented, and obviously other policies as well, that the site would have to be in accordance with, they have been tested for our viability assessment. And in terms of the thresholds that applies, that this falls within those. So there certainly is the scope for those to be brought forwards.
Has there been any information around the care home provision in the pre-application discussions? Has there been any assumptions made about the care home provision and whether that is appropriate, viable, deliverable on this site?
There's certainly been consideration. I think obviously there's also the prospect that you can look at other alternative ways of achieving the same aim, whereby you could be looking at older persons housing being met through rather than a standalone care home facility, institutional sort of side of things. There could also be the ways of bringing forward those types of uses in extra care, for example. That also could be a prospect of that. So. By no means, obviously, at this stage, that finalised and gets to going through that process, but there's certainly consideration of the emerging policies has been part of those pre-app discussions.
Mr. Stevens?
Thank you. So just one small point, just to come back on something that was just mentioned recently. That the trajectory then in the statement of common ground, from what's been said, appears to rely on the evidence of Hermes. It's just the point, I suppose, how much then can you rely on that evidence from? I mean, I appreciate they are the site promoter, a landowner of the majority of the site. but they're not a house builder, and they, as an investment company, their knowledge and expertise in delivering housing sites, particularly on brownfield sites, may be fairly limited, I suspect. So I suppose we just caution again the reliance you can place on that evidence.
Thank you.
Just to come back on that, Inspector, obviously, yes, I understand that Hermes is not a developer, but they have obviously got appointed a number of consultants that have got experience in the field, obviously delivering sites. So I would disagree with that point. Obviously, they have been informed. By no means is it guesswork. They obviously are being informed by their consultants, which have obviously been part of that process.
Thank you. What the policy refers to a number of development principles, some of which we've discussed. But I've got two particular questions. One is about the village centre. What is envisaged about the village centre, about the scale of that, nature of that, and if you know, you might not know, but presume that it's been feeding into those pre-application discussions. And then the links with West Horndon Station. What might be envisaged by that?
Yes, thank you. So in terms of the again, we're reflecting back on what was said earlier in terms of the importance of this site and its position within the village and the opportunities that it affords. So that's why that requirement has been put into that in terms of creation, enhancement of the village centre. And certainly with a lot of the other points that we've put in within the policy, they sort of centre around that. So where we talk about the need for improved health facilities, for example, that is envisaged, that could be part of that, recognising that the existing doctors' facilities within the village has got limited access and is based in an or previous residential unit. And there's the opportunity for bringing together that with public open space, for example. Obviously, that is going to be throughout the site, but that equally could be part of the offer of enhancing the village centre layout or the village enhancements that could be brought forward on the site. And I think in terms of the linkages to the train station, I think clearly it's the most important thing there. Linked in with the access is and what's been looked at is the pedestrian cycle movements. That's more key really in terms of where someone's living on that site, their connection to the train station is going to be key, notwithstanding that they may well still own a car, but the actual the priority is for pedestrians and cyclists, and that's obviously linking in also to the wider improvements that are being looked at the train station in connection with Dunton Hills Garden Village proposals. So obviously with this proposal as it comes forwards, it's the consideration of how the design of that site is accommodating that, and that's certainly been at the forefront of what's been ongoing discussions of looking at those opportunities that this site can bring forwards.
And in terms of the infrastructure requirements in C, the health facilities, provision for health facilities, is that on-site?
I mean,
community health facilities, for example.
Yeah, it could be. I think in terms, obviously, with the potential for relocating and improving the existing doctors' facility, notwithstanding any sort of investment that would be required in regards to any development coming forward. Obviously, they need to provide contributions according to what the NHS outline in their response. In terms of improved bus service, obviously there is a bus service already, albeit very minimal. It obviously requires some investment, but clearly it's going to be about the linkages with the improvements that will come forward as part of Dunton Hills Garden Village, and the improvements to bus services as part of that. But the most important thing is to ensure that there's a good choice of accessibility, particularly to the station.
So the improved bus service is so to enable buses to come into the site, linking to the station, but also linking to Brentwood.
No, I think it's probably more for the point of view of making sure that they've provided sort of appropriate contributions to improving the bus service that will go into the station as opposed to coming into the site, because the walking distance is short enough if you lived on the far edge of the site that you wouldn't need to get a bus to go anywhere if you're going into the station. It would be more a case of just providing appropriate contributions to bus services along that station road. There's
No, it's been the transport assessment has been updated and leading into the IDP, and in terms of assessing viability. But what is the expectation in terms of off-site requirements for infrastructure for this site, particularly in respect to transport?
So principally, obviously linking into the train station in terms of providing contributions in conjunction with other sites that come forward. And obviously, again, we'll come on to that, I say, in more detail through the infrastructure and transport session. But the intention, at least, is to make sure that the train station has appropriate investment to accommodate additional footfall, and obviously improvements that are needed to that in conjunction with Dunstan Hills Garden Village, the additional footfall that will come from that as well. In terms of as mentioned earlier, obviously the expectation that sites will contribute appropriately to strategic transport infrastructure in the plan. And so that this would be no different for this site, whereby that's expected they'll make appropriate contributions to the strategic road network. Notwithstanding obviously the specifics of actual access improvements to the site itself, but that's obviously more site specific to this one. But in terms of off-site, that's what we expect in line with the IDP.
Okay. Mrs. Wright, have you got any questions in relation to this session?
Just bear with me. I've just been looking at the suggested changes to the policy set out in F9A, and just wanted to understand, there is an addition about potential heritage impact. So I just wanted to understand where that's come from, and what heritage impact that relates to, so that we can just understand whether that's necessary to be in there, considering you've already got heritage policies anyway elsewhere in the plan. But is there anything in particular that you need reference to, such as an adjacent listed building or?
As I understand, thank you, Inspector. Sorry. As I understand it, the requirement was the origins of that was from the Historic England comments to the addendum of focus changes. In terms of the actual specifics, I think it might be a case of the proximity, again, as we were talking about earlier with site R07, proximity to the historic park and gardens aspect, which is far north, to be fair, in terms of the Horndon Country Park. I think part of that designation does fall slightly south of the A127. But in terms of actual specific specific points, I think, yeah, it's basically referring back to Historic England, really, in terms of the points that they've requested that. I think that was set out in our heritage examination notes. Apologies, just find the reference to that. That was F3J. I'll just find the paragraph reference to that.
Can I point to the statement of compliance with Historic England as well? Is F17I.
Yeah, so in terms of, sorry to jump about, but the F3J is paragraph 7.2, where they basically want to ensure sympathetic development for sites R02 and others. And effectively, it was just to cover what they felt was required in terms of surrounding heritage assets or area, but they didn't necessarily specify specifically in relation to R02.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Phone, I think on this particular point, I think because I think you put your hand up quite quickly on this point. So have you got anything that you can add to that?
There could be a problem issue if you look at the land between Petersfield Way and the industrial estate, which is all mixed up in this. There is a covenant on that. The land was originally given to when it was given and sold, had a covenant on it that said it had to be used. There were restrictions on the use, and they were for community things. Originally, that land was the Howard factory's football field, And when they sold it, gave it away, they insisted that there was a covenant put on it that said that the land was used for, and I can't remember the wording, and I'm sorry, somebody would have to, I'd have to go back to look at it, but there were restrictions on what that land could be used for. I know that historically there have been discussions as to whether or not that covenant could be unpicked, but it could be a difficulty in using that land if it wasn't used for sporting, social purposes of some description. So I just throw that in. I don't know if that has any impact on it, but I'm certainly aware, going back into history, that there was an application to put a social club there, that it never got completed, and that's why the land is not used for residential at the present minute.
Thank you. I've got nothing further, Mr. Warden.
Thank you. Has the council got any points it wishes to make in conclusion?
No, thanks. Thank you, Inspector.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions. Thank you. Thank you very much for your contributions, and apologies once again to Councillor Phone. I hope you've managed to say everything you need to say.
This particular thing is about the West Horndon Industrial Estate, but in the same paragraphs within your document on MIQ, there is a later bit about policy E13, which is the East Horndon Industrial Estate. That hasn't been addressed today, although there are a number of questions there that are extremely important to be looked at. Can you tell me when that's going to be dealt with? In my document, it's paragraph 100. Policy E13, East Horndon Hall.
Do you want me to come in on that, Mr. Warden?
Yes, I can have a look. If you know the answer, please say.
Yes, because I'm dealing with that session. It's tomorrow afternoon when we're dealing with employment sites or other employment sites. We haven't dealt with every employment site. It's where they have been linked in. We've then split some of them out. So we've got E11, E10, E12 and E13 tomorrow afternoon.
Okay. Can I bring an issue up as to where it is appropriate to deal with it? As you will be aware, that site has now got an outline planning application attached to it. And it's very unfortunate that that was forced through, in my humble view, against the recommendation of Brentwood Council's officers, because it was forced through in isolation and means that it will make it, I think, much more difficult for you as inspectors to look at it in the wider context. And there is a wider context, because associated with that site, and has not been properly reflected, are some extreme flood risk issues that have not been addressed. Now, they do need to be addressed because the site itself, by developing it, does increase the flood risk. I know that Essex Council don't acknowledge that, although there's a history of muddle that goes through, and I would need to take you through that. So now is perhaps not the right time. But I must make sure that you are aware of those issues, because I believe that they make the Brentwood local plan fundamentally invalid, because it conflicts with the NPPF's guidance that local development should not include flood risk, and that it has to be. It's not just on the site itself, but it has to, how it reflects into the wider community. Now, I don't know how you want to deal with that, but I really must insist that that is brought forward to you, because as I look at all the documentation, it's not understood. And certainly when I spoke to flood officers in Essex County Council back in July 2019, they didn't understand it either. So I must make you aware of that, because it is extremely important.
Thank you, Mr. Phone. As the site has planning permission, the council has put forward a suggested change to remove the site as an allocation within the plan. So that so tomorrow discussions will be on that basis, that it's proposed to be removed from the plan.
Yes, but
Therefore,
question A in your document says, have exceptional circumstances for the site's removal from the green belt been demonstrated? And
But
I will contend no.
but the site has planning permission.
Yes, but because the site has planning permission, it doesn't mean that it doesn't impact on the flood risk assessment for the whole of the village, because what actually happens at that village, is in extreme circumstances, water washes off the adjacent fields onto that site, and it acts as a flood reservoir, protecting the rest of the village. Now, if they build on it, then that will no longer act as that. They say that they're going to put tanks that will look at the existing, that will deal with the existing.
Councillor Phone, can I just I realise you're very passionate about this this particular area. We are looking at it from a local plan perspective and whether a site should or should not be allocated. This site has outline planning permission, so there is it will be up to the Borough Council in determining reserved matters and the detailed element of that to decide what mitigation measures, if necessary, need to be put in place in relation to any flood risk and flooding. So those elements that come forward. The site, in relation to dealing with that site as part of, as I said, it will be raised tomorrow as part of the discussion on the employment sites. But as the site has planning permission, it is now a commitment rather than an allocation. So in planning, in local plan terms, that's the way that we look at those sites, because it already has planning permission. It's up to the council and relevant other stakeholders to bring that site forward for development, because it in relation to the detailed matters.
So where do you, as the planning inspector, consider the wider issues of flood risk management in the area of West Horndon? Because surely, if you look at the NPPF, it's very clear that flood risk management has to be considered. And it's not just about that site, it's the way that site interacts with the rest of the land around. And I need to make you aware of it, because it is that site, but it is not just that site, it's the wider considerations, and they are not being considered. And I'm afraid Essex County Council the flood risk team there have made very significant, well, they lost, to be honest, when I spoke to them in July, they admitted that they had lost the flood risk records of what happened when a serious number of houses were flooded in this village in 2012, and the church was flooded again in 2013. We're not talking, this is serious. This isn't just, academic. It's about people's lives, people's houses getting flooded. It cannot be ignored in the local development plan, I would have thought.
Mr. Shatarevian, please.
Ma'am, so far as I'm aware, none of the site is in a flood zone, and the council, in granting outline planning permission, satisfied itself that there were no flooding issues that could not be dealt with through the design of the scheme and appropriate mitigation. So those matters have been considered in principle.
I'm sorry to bring this up now, but the flood risk maps that were put forward by the Environment Agency, that they identify flood risks in the village, but they don't identify them outside. Now, that's because the Environment Agency deals with fluvial flooding for rivers, and this village does not suffer from that. It suffers from surface water flooding. If you look at all the assessments that have been published, and we have made this point numerous times, but they have appeared deep down in the annexes, but nobody has ever addressed them. The flooding occurs in this village when it gets serious because water comes off Horndon Country Park over the A127, as it did on Christmas Day 2012, and that then moved
Councillor Phone, can I suggest that you take this up with the relevant authority, so with the county council and with the borough council outside? This is not a matter to discuss as part of the local plan.
So you don't. So planning inspector, you don't care about whether or not houses get flooded or not.
Councillor Phone, that is not what I'm saying, and I do not like that tone that you've used, implying that we are not considering that. I completely understand that you're very passionate about this issue, and quite rightly so. You're a local resident and you're trying to look at, and you're obviously a parish councillor, and you wish to look after your local residents. And I completely understand that you're concerned about this issue. Now, in relation to the point that you raised was about site E13, and I've answered that question about that. In relation to other flooding issues, we are coming up to, or will be discussing environment matters, and we have some of the relevant policies in the plan that we will be discussing, but we will be looking at those not in relation to specific sites. It will be looking at what the policies are trying to achieve and whether those policies are sound. And in relation to a local plan perspective, then we are looking at whether the policies and the site allocations that are set out in the plan are sound. So we look at the individual allocations as they are set. So what I suggest is that you do have this, and I understand that you've had these discussions with the council, but you may wish to take these discussions further with the council outside the remit of the local plan examination. We are only here to look at the plan as it's submitted.
So the fact that there is a fundamental flaw in the way that plan was constructed, because the flood risk assessments are fundamentally flawed, is not something that you can consider.
Well, I'm not going to discuss this matter any further here. Okay. We have to go forward. We have to have a break, and then we've got another sessions this afternoon. If it's something that you wish to discuss with the council outside of this session, I would urge you to do so. Whether you wish to come along to a different session to discuss where it's appropriate and appropriate to the representations that you've made, then if you can have that chat with Ms. Feeney, then we would be more than happy for you to come into those relevant sessions, whether it's the environment sessions, to discuss those particular points. Okay, so thank you very much, Councillor Phone. Mr. Shadorevian.
Sorry, Ma'am, I forgot to take my hand down. Apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Wright. I don't have any further questions, and the council don't wish to make any further points. So thank you very much for your contributions on the West Horndon session. I think the plan is still to start at 2 o'clock. If Annette can confirm.
Yes, please, if we could restart at 2 o'clock.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you.